The streets of Kyiv seem normal in wartime. The cafes and bars are full. The buses and trams are running. Life goes on as normal. Until the air raid alarm is just the tip of the iceberg. A short glance at the country doesn't reveal the lives spent in fear, the falling earnings, and events like the funerals of those killed due to the Russian aggression. This is daily life in Ukraine. Practically every single Ukrainian has lost someone close to them due to this war. In today's film, we discuss what is the state of Ukraine. How much longer can it resist? What damage has the war caused? What is life like in the country now? Ukraine is one of the fastest depopulating countries in the world. It was like this already before Russia's full-scale invasion. If we don't count those in the occupied territories, before February 24, 2024, there were 38 million people in Ukraine. At the beginning of 2024, in the territories controlled by Kyiv, there were around 7 to 9 million fewer people. This is the equivalent of London or New York City. Scenes like these, with entirely abandoned villages, are now normal in Ukraine.
The phenomenon of villages dying out is seen increasingly often, entire rural areas. This will only get worse and will have serious consequences for the country's ability to defend itself, especially near the border with Belarus and Russia.
How many people have died in the war? The figures are not clear. The number of confirmed civilian deaths is currently between 10 and 20,000. The real figure might be higher. Then there are the fallen combatants. In December 2024, Zelensky stated that 43,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in the war, but these estimates appear to fall short. There are very many more people who have left Ukraine. There could be as many as 5 to 6.5 million of them.
If these people do not return to Ukraine en masse sooner or later, if they don't start families, then the birth rate won't increase by much, and Ukraine will have a huge decline in the coming years.
Not everyone left their country. There are 5 million internally displaced Ukrainians who fled the war to safety in other parts of Ukraine. To put this figure into perspective, the great evacuation of civilians in Britain during the Second World War saw under 4 million people moved. This is having a huge impact on Ukraine.
There's a progressing pauperization in terms of finding accommodation. It's not a good situation, but it's not tragic because some people have left the cities, so there are a number of freed-up properties, and some of these internally displaced refugees can find something to rent, but they are facing poverty. They generally work in the lowest-paying parts of the economy with salaries below the equivalent of 500 euros.
Life in the cities looks normal, but it is of course interrupted by the air raid sirens.
Ukrainians are trying to adapt somehow, to live as normally as possible. It's a kind of new normal. So when there's no air raid siren when you travel to Ukraine for the first time, life may appear more or less normal. Surprisingly normal. The restaurants are mostly open, there are people in town. The public transport is running. But again, after bombardment, the power outages are often larger than usual. Of course, in some places, such as cinemas and restaurants, you might not notice much because the companies have alternative power sources. They have generators. Nonetheless, when people go home, they often find they have no water or electricity. This is the reality which a visitor living in a hotel with a generator doesn't see. They have heating, they go to restaurants, they go to institutions. For them, nothing much changed apart from the air raid alert. But for Ukrainians, this is their new normal, which makes their lives very difficult and tiresome.
This normality is an illusion. When you walk the streets of Kyiv, you can't see the emotions people are dealing with. Everybody lives in fear of the air raid warnings. Almost all Ukrainians know someone fighting at the front or who's in direct danger. This carries a psychological cost. The World Health Organization estimates that as many as 9.6 million Ukrainians are at risk of a mental health condition or are already living with one. The economic collapse is not visible at first glance. In recent quarters, Ukraine's GDP has grown, but only relative to its huge fall in 2022. Ukraine's pre-war GDP levels are still a long way off.
Znaczy tak, PKB rośnie.
Yes, GDP is growing, but we have to remember that it's after the truly catastrophic collapse in 2022, when it dropped by nearly a third. Even that was better than the first forecasts when war broke out. Regardless, it was a huge fall, but due to foreign finance, the economy, well, I wouldn't say it instantly started to dynamically develop, because these are minor gains. But yes, it is minimally growing, and the forecasts also show some growth.
While the country does appear to be functioning normally, this is only possible due to Western support.
Można powiedzieć, że to, co Ukraina...
We can say that the Ukrainian state's revenue from taxes of various sorts is only just enough to cover defense spending, and that's about half the budget. The other half is, in principle, entirely financed by grants and loans from Western donors, worth many billions, around $40 billion annually. This is why Ukraine is able to function as a state, why the salaries and pensions are paid, why the budget functions.
We've all seen these scenes: war damage, destroyed factories, residential buildings, and government buildings. What is the scale of this destruction? In February 2024, the World Bank estimated that the direct costs linked to the Russian aggression totaled $152 billion. This would be enough to build 20,000 kilometers of motorway or 100 Wembley stadiums. The World Bank claims the country will need even more money for its reconstruction, $486 billion over 10 years. This is almost 4 times the cost of the Marshall Plan, and equivalent to the GDP of oil and gas-rich Norway. So the future of the Ukrainian economy is linked to foreign aid. An important financial mechanism was recently passed, enabling the use of the interest earned on frozen Russian assets in the West. These and other resources should make sure Ukraine has money for 2025 and for much of 2026.
Ta sytuacja względnej stabilności gospodarczej...
This relatively stable economic situation can be sustained as long as the billions in support coming from the West continues. For next year, everything suggests that, regardless of the election result in the US, this support will continue, and probably also in 2026. But what will the situation look like when we try to assume that this war will end in, let's say, 2 years? So, without this support continuing, if only on a smaller scale, but even that is still a large amount of money, without that, there's a huge chance that Ukraine's economy will face a large crisis.
Ukraine is also struggling with a labor shortage. The number of civilians in employment between the ages of 15 and 70 has fallen by 25%. Research shows that as many as 74% of business owners state that they are aware of a worker shortage. It's easy to figure out the root cause: war emigration. But this is not the only reason.
Problemem jest mobilizacja.
Mobilization is a problem. It affects companies being totally legally run. When they employ somebody legally, they have to report this to the military recruitment command. From that point onwards, the employee can be called up to the army. And more people don't want to take that risk, and so choose to work illegally, where they will be undetectable. They'll do anything to avoid legal employment. But in Ukraine, very many companies are run entirely above board. This is a huge problem.
We need to mention that the Ukrainians themselves dealt with many problems. The National Bank of Ukraine is especially deserving of praise. The actions it took and foreign aid meant that inflation was kept under control, and many indicators show that the economy is still standing in spite of the great losses. Ukraine was also successful in keeping open the pre-war trade routes, for example on the Black Sea. This meant that Ukraine's exports didn't take such a disastrous turn as it might have. But the specter of corruption still hangs over Ukraine. The war has seen new schemes emerge.
The army's being helped by volunteers. There are foundations which raise money to buy equipment, above all vehicles. There are many examples where these foundations turn out to be organized crime groups pretending to provide aid to the armed forces. They buy these 4x4s but then sell them on the open market. These cases are being uncovered, but it is still going on.
People smuggling is another symptom of the new criminality. This is of course linked to draft dodging.
The amounts of money for this range from $5,000 to $10,000, so it's big business.
Another route out of the country is by getting an international road haulage license. This license can be purchased, and last year in Lviv, this happened 2,000 times. But emigration is not the only way to avoid being called up. The military committees have also been affected by corruption. It was so extreme that President Zelensky closed them all down. One other obvious scheme is through medical committees.
There was quite an interesting case in Khmelnytsky Oblast where 3 doctors were responsible for issuing these certificates and earned over $1 million. That's a lot of money, bearing in mind that depending on the kind of certificate, you need to pay a few $1,000s. It's interesting that Ukrainian society isn't so poor because very many people are able to pay such high bribes.
The government is trying to combat this scheme and have decided to digitize the system.
This means that once the digital document is introduced, the doctors will be obliged first of all to enter which specific doctor gave this particular diagnosis, and it will be more transparent than the version on paper, because then there was no effective means of inspection.
When irregularities are uncovered, it's a sign that the system is working, that the free press is functioning. What about the intelligence services? We all know the stereotype of a Second World War spy who works in hotels, gaining the trust of officers to steal sensitive information. But today, the threats are different. That spy is more likely to be a young person with a smartphone, taking pictures as a military column drives past their window. The Russians recruit a lot of people on Telegram. It's straightforward. Take a photo and tell us where you saw the military, and we'll give you some money. Sometimes, though, they are given more complex tasks to fulfill.
There was a case recently uncovered where a 16-year-old was hired to set fire to post offices in Kyiv. Others are paid to set fire to military vehicles and so on. There's a constant threat here too. This means that Ukraine's counterintelligence has dealt with searching for these people online very well indeed. Spotting some careless online activity helps identify a specific person.
But these are not the only threats. There have been cases of embedded Russian agents. For example, Ukraine's intelligence agency was revealed to have several high-ranking officers who were cooperating with Russia's FSB to assassinate Zelensky.
So the infiltration of Russian intelligence agents still presents a challenge for the Ukrainian services. This problem will always exist, and it's not only a story about someone's past who served in the KGB, because a lot of time has already passed and there aren't many of these people. But some people are useful. Firstly, those who had some connection with Russia. In peacetime, they might have had family in Russia and are still being exploited. The Russian services also use other methods to recruit people, mainly financial ones. Let's not fool ourselves. These are not really ideological agents. Sometimes there could be some compromising materials. We've got something on you. Something we won't show anyone if you agree to help us out.
This is Andriy Yermak. Formally, he's the head of the office of the president, so Zelensky's chief advisor. Informally, he's the second most important person in the country. In wartime Ukraine, a system has emerged which the press is calling an office presidential system. The name itself stresses that although the office of the president should be an advisory, it has outgrown its competences and is creating policy, and is often placed higher than government ministers. This is particularly stark in the case of Yermak himself. He has an unprecedented range of competences, far beyond those formally belonging to his position. He's the one who discusses Russian sanctions with foreign politicians, who organizes peace summits and the return of Ukrainian children. And these are only a few examples.
Yermak także zajmuje się, powiedzielibyśmy, pewną polityką kadrową.
We could say he's responsible for a certain personnel policy, and we can understand that this includes removing real and potential political competitors for President Zelensky. For example, Yermak is thought to be responsible for getting the highly popular General Valery Zaluzhny out of Ukraine. Zaluzhny could have been a potential rival for Zelensky, as he was the only person in the country with higher approval ratings. Yermak also removes people who are too independent of the government, because the president's office wants loyalty above all, loyalty to Yermak and Zelensky. If someone's suspected of having good relations with foreign ambassadors, for example, then they're removed, as Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Kubrakov discovered to his cost.
The role of the parliament is diminishing in the Ukrainian state. This process had already begun before the war. If we want to understand why, we need to go back to 2019. Zelensky wins the presidential election, and his party, Servant of the People, will soon win a majority. Zelensky announces there will be a turbo regime. This would mean that Ukraine's parliament would quickly pass bills presented by the president. It reached a point where MPs literally did not have enough time to read through the bills they were voting on. Today, there is no turbo regime, but the role of the parliament is undergoing a process of degradation. In wartime, live broadcasts from the parliament have been suspended, and journalists are not even allowed in.
Debata publiczna bardzo się zepsuła, właściwie debata nad...
And we've reached a point where public debate has gone very bad. To all intents and purposes, there is now no debate on bills in the Verkhovna Rada. The parliament has become a kind of executive of orders coming from the president's office.
Does this have an impact on Zelensky's popularity? A majority of Ukrainians still trust him, but his ratings are falling. At the start of 2024, around 70% of Ukrainians trusted him. Now it hovers around the 50% mark. How will this play out in possible support during an election? One opinion poll stated that Zelensky would get 27% of the vote in the first round of an election, and that General Zaluzhny would get the same result, with former President Poroshenko receiving only 7%. A runoff between Zelensky and Zaluzhny would be won by the latter.
Valery Zaluzhny is currently in the UK in a diplomatic post. In fact, he never said he wanted to become president to run for office, so we don't know if he will run, if he'll be a viable alternative to Zelensky.
It needs to be reiterated, though, that according to the law, there can be no elections in Ukraine during martial law, and this is also the consensus view in Ukraine.
Jednak cały czas można znaleźć pewne plotki.
But all the time we hear about rumors that there will in fact be an election in Ukraine, in spite of martial law, that there'll be local elections in 2025. But as I said, the law forbids this, and organizing them would create a raft of problems, logistical, technical, such as how to compile electoral registers, how to make sure external and internal refugees can vote, how to keep people safe during a war when bombs and missiles are falling on towns and cities. And they'd need to change the law on martial law. And for Ukraine to be able to hold an election, the whole of Ukrainian society is aware of the problems and is unanimous in stating that it doesn't want elections during martial law, that they should wait until after the war. And anyway, in November 2023, all the main parties in parliament signed a joint declaration that there would be no elections until the war ends, which is of course in line with the law.
So does Zelensky have a serious rival among opposition politicians? The short answer is no. Opinion polls showed 40% of those polled stated that they'd support a party of soldiers. This lays bare the crisis of the Ukrainian opposition.
Looking at the current opposition, it's easy to see that most opposition politicians lead the rankings of least trusted politicians. Yulia Tymoshenko is mistrusted by around 80% of Ukrainians. Petro Poroshenko is not much better, but it's at least better than other politicians.
Oligarchs. In large part, they were the rulers of Ukraine. They had their own parties, their own TV channels. Now it's changed, and their influence is limited. One example of this is Rinat Akhmetov. His assets were in large part located in the Donbass, including in Mariupol and Avdiivka. He is one of the many oligarchs who saw their fortune reduced due to the war. Many of them also had businesses in Russia and obviously had to close them. And those oligarchs, with a pro-Russian stance, had some of their assets confiscated. These wealthy Ukrainians are the creators of the Grammarly app, and their worth increased by 235% between 2021 and 2023. But they cannot be called oligarchs. But it wasn't only war losses which reduced oligarchs' income. The way information is spread has also had an effect. Oligarchs used to be the rulers of television, and Ukrainians learned about events in their country from them, from TV stations controlled by the oligarchs. This meant they could sway public opinion. But now, Ukrainians get their news from the internet and social media, and these are more difficult to control.
W związku z tym również ten
Therefore, their ability to influence the media and society has largely stopped working. The more so because many oligarch-owned media organizations have become part of the so-called information telethon, which is a joint broadcast of several Ukrainian TV stations, and it is in fact overseen by the President's office.
The war. We can't talk about Ukraine without mentioning the war. How is Ukraine defending itself? Let's look at these maps. This one is from before Russia's full-scale invasion. And this one is from February 24th, 2023. And next to it is the current map. You could be mistaken for thinking they're the same map. The difference between them is barely visible. Russia's grand war to take the whole of Ukraine is mainly taking place in the Donbass. And Russia still hasn't taken all of that region.
In short, the Ukrainian army is defending itself well against Russia. It's inflicting large-scale damage on Russia, mainly due to the enthusiasm of a part of society and volunteers and mobilized soldiers drafted into the ranks, mainly those who entered the ranks in the first year of the war. This is the backbone of the Ukrainian army, which is decisive in terms of its battle potential, its strength. And, as I said, Ukraine was effective in its resistance.
But it now looks as if the Ukrainian army is in crisis. In terms of equipment, the situation is not disastrous. The West needs to provide more, of course, but mobilization is a bigger problem. There are simply not enough people, especially in the frontline infantry.
Tutaj państwo ukraińskie nie zdaje tego egzaminu.
And here the Ukrainian state is not passing the test. I'd say that the crisis we're currently observing in the Ukrainian army, the crisis at the front, that above all, it's a crisis playing out in Kyiv and not at the front. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces, meaning President Zelensky and his team, are not able to deal with the challenge of mobilization. It's been limited, providing the army with the minimum amount of soldiers it needs to execute the war. There are also clear signs that mobilization has focused above all on the poorer parts of society, citizens of small towns and villages, sparing the people of the metropolises as much as possible, cities such as Kyiv, Dnipro, Odessa, Lviv, etc. We need to say that this situation is very bad, and if it isn't fundamentally changed, it could lead to a catastrophe or to a loss of morale along that thin line of infantry that stretches along the 1,000-kilometer front and defends the country from Russian aggression.
The government is doing little to change the situation. There is no decisive action to improve things in the military recruitment centers. The system of coercion is also a problem. Ukraine de facto has no military police like in NATO countries or Russia. The military court system is also in bad shape.
To nie jest żadna tajemnica, mówi się o tym powszechnie.
It's not a secret. Everybody talks about the number of deserters. It's in the tens of thousands, and it just means that the only ones who are fighting are those who want to do it. If you don't want to fight, then there are many ways to get out of it. People are simply running away. This mainly concerns soldiers who have recently been mobilized, those who entered the ranks recently, in the second half of 2024. Their morale is the lowest. Their attitude creates the most problems.
It's clear that the Ukrainian army is performing well, but the situation could be better.
Armia ukraińska ma ogromny potencjał mobilizacji.
The Ukrainian army has enormous potential for mobilization. I'd say that, from what we've seen over the last 2 years or so, that a rot is setting in. Instead of a gradual improvement, instead of improving the organization, leadership and logistics, we're seeing pathologies come to the fore in many areas. Nevertheless, we still have this motivated backbone of the army based on volunteers and on part of the professional corps. These people want to fight, and they know how to do it. They can inflict huge damage on the Russians. And it's worth emphasizing that at certain points on the front where the best Ukrainian brigades are fighting, the Russian losses are several times higher than Ukraine's.
It's Volodymyr Zelensky who de facto makes the decisions in Ukraine, including on military matters.
Mam takie wrażenie, że
Instead of consistently shifting the state onto a war footing, mobilizing industry, mobilizing society, ensuring the rotation of troops, and ensuring that Ukraine turns into a well-oiled machine which will crush each new Russian attack, this system is decoupled. In many aspects, it's improvised and has an ineffective post-Soviet bureaucracy. For example, this concerns the activity of military recruitment centers. Zelensky's faced a lot of criticism in Ukraine precisely for this lack of consistency and lack of a strategy, because he didn't decide to become a Churchill and ask society to make sacrifices, to give things up, to be disciplined. Instead, he's letting many Ukrainians maintain the illusion that the war is far away, that it doesn't affect them, and that it will end soon.
One of the tough decisions which hasn't been made is to mobilize Ukraine's industry.
History teaches us that mobilizing industry includes the introduction of state management to some factories, extending the workday, and technical mobilization means, for example, mobilizing citizens' means of transport. Nothing like that has happened, and the arms industry and related industries in Ukraine are currently running more or less according to normal market principles. There's obviously some investment from the state, which has injected lots of additional money to develop the production of some types of arms and military equipment. But this is not the mobilization of industry compared to Britain, for example, in the First or Second World War. I don't intend to compare Ukraine to totalitarian states. I want to compare it to democracies such as the US or the UK during the Second World War. I'd say there's no sign of anything like that. Everything is still on a peacetime footing, just with increased funding, increased orders, but it's not going hand in hand with harnessing society for the war effort.
But voluntary work has played an enormous role in defending Ukraine.
Tak, fenomenem społeczeństwa ukraińskiego jest wolontariat. To jest zjawisko.
Yes, volunteering is a Ukrainian social phenomenon on a large scale. In the third year of the war, I think tens of thousands of people are directly involved in volunteering. They organize work, give up their time to help the army. But not only the army, also elderly people and animals, the disabled, injured people, or people traumatized by the war. There are very many areas where volunteers are active, and in many ways they're replacing the work of state institutions. At the moment, it's difficult to imagine how Ukraine could wage this war with Russia for so long without the effort of these volunteers. It's a clear sign of the incredible good health of Ukrainian society, of its sacrifice. And it's incredible to see the range of problems we've spoken about: poverty, exhaustion. These volunteers are constantly active, and many people, in spite of their own fatigue, are still working with great enthusiasm and making a very large contribution to the national war effort.
Foreign policy. Ukraine has opened EU accession talks. This is a clear success for Ukraine's diplomacy.
Impulsem dla aktywności dyplomatycznej.
The catalyst for this diplomatic activity is found in the social mood. Over 80% of Ukrainian citizens state they're in favor of integrating with the EU, and over 70% are in favor of NATO integration. This provides determination and energy for Volodymyr Zelensky to take on these challenges as fast as possible, to obtain EU and NATO membership, which is seen as a guarantee of the security and further development of the country.
We should point out here that opening accession talks is not only a show of solidarity with Ukraine, it also demonstrates how far the country has come along the path of reforms.
Due to meeting the European Commission's recommendations formulated in June 2022, Ukraine received the approval of the civil servants in Brussels. In order to open these accession negotiations, this especially concerned the fight against corruption within the entire infrastructure, all institutions and organizations responsible for this area. It's also the issue of purging or renewing the procedures for selecting judges, a reform of the entire judiciary, which has in fact been a weak point of the Ukrainian state since the beginning of its modern existence in 1991. This also concerns issues linked to legislation on national minorities. This is often raised by Viktor Orban by Hungary, which has been effectively blocking Ukraine's integration with the European Union. Kyiv has managed to effectively achieve this in 2.5 years. This is a success for Ukraine in the EU integration process.
The screening process is currently underway. This involves reviewing the compatibility of EU and Ukrainian law. When this is completed, Ukraine's law begins its adaptation to EU law.
Ukraine has expressed its hope that when the presidency goes to Poland's government in 2025, this will launch the proper negotiations on particular accession chapters. Above all, this concerns the first and most difficult chapter, called the Fundamentals, which concerns the rule of law, the primacy of citizens' freedom, fighting corruption, and so those issues which Ukraine has had the most problems with so far. It's the chapter which will be opened first and the one which will be closed last, concluding the entire accession process. In connection with this, Kyiv has expressed huge optimism that this chapter will be opened during the Polish presidency and that this will be the inauguration of a successful process. When will it end? It's an open question. Zelensky's administration has said it expects it will take 2 years. We need to be very skeptical about such a rapid process. It's more likely to take several years. But I still feel that over the last several months or the last year or so, that the Zelensky administration and those people directly responsible for negotiating with Brussels, that they've taken a bit more realistic approach. What do I mean by that? Precisely the need to adapt Ukraine's legislation, accepting the principles in place in the EU, and the need to negotiate with individual countries, including with Poland. We remember, of course, the Polish farmers' protests. All of this doesn't just require adapting the EU to take on Ukraine, a large country with great economic, demographic, and geographical potential. It also needs Ukraine to understand those sectors of the economy in the individual member states which will be sensitive precisely to the effects of integrating Ukraine into the EU.
Of course, the next priority for Ukraine will be NATO membership. But many influential member countries are resisting this, and this is why Ukraine is focusing on bilateral security guarantees.
In doing this, Kyiv wants to define the commitments which are contained in the now 27 documents it signed with Western countries. The right word is commitments or guarantees concerning providing military equipment to provide financial and economic support to Ukraine concerning increasing Ukraine's military potential. Nevertheless, Kyiv views the signing of these guarantees as only a certain step, as one stage in the process of becoming a full NATO member. NATO membership will remain the priority, and this is because of the social mood. Over 77% of Ukrainian citizens declare they want Ukraine in NATO, and this is a significant catalyst for Zelensky's diplomatic activity in this direction.
While it's crucial for Ukraine to secure peace, first, it needs to end the current war. Donald Trump's election victory triggered a change in the Ukrainian narrative. Recently, Zelensky, for the first time, conceded that not all of Ukraine's sovereign territory might be won back militarily.
Do tej pory tak naprawdę obowiązywały.
To date, it was the rule in official communication that we will not give up an inch of our sovereignty, that these are not things we'll compromise on. But at the turn of November and December, we heard a few interviews, for example on Sky News and the Japanese press agency, where Zelensky said in a straightforward manner that it's possible to see Ukraine, well, not giving up territory, because that's impossible, and not in de jure terms, but it could leave that territory for the moment. But only if Ukraine receives serious security guarantees, meaning that the territory which it controls comes under the NATO security umbrella, meaning that Ukraine will quickly be accepted into NATO. But the security guarantees would only cover the territory which Ukraine is effectively controlling.
In short, this means Ukraine has signaled it's prepared to temporarily lose control over some of its territory. In this way, Ukraine would maintain its sovereignty. This has been Zelensky's response to Donald Trump and his team.
And in all of this more or less official information coming from across the pond about various plans to end the war, they all have one thing in common. The situation at the front can be frozen where the armies are based. In this, it looks like Zelensky wants to show that he's constructive and ready to talk, as opposed to Russia. And he also wants to define his terms, which means accepting Ukraine into NATO.
It's also important that Ukrainians are increasingly willing to negotiate with Russia.
In fact, it's hard to talk about the numbers because there's a large margin of error in any public opinion poll in Ukraine. But in general, it's an upward trajectory, so an increasing proportion of Ukrainians are prepared to negotiate with Russia. Of course, later it's a bit more complicated because it depends on the conditions of the ceasefire. There's complete awareness that if Ukraine isn't strengthened in military, financial and diplomatic terms, in large part by the West, then any ceasefire will only be a pause in hostilities until the next Russian attack. This means there needs to be something really strong if Ukraine is to agree to come to the negotiating table to discuss this ceasefire.
But will Russia also want to negotiate?
At present, it looks like Russia is not keen. At least declaratively, the Russian government does not immediately reject those plans, Trump's statement that he wants to end the war. But there's another form of communication which suggests that, yes, we're ready to talk, but our red lines are, practically speaking, Ukraine's capitulation, demilitarization, denazification, etc. Those were Putin's 5 points in June 2024, and really not much had changed from Russia's demands before the war and during the talks in the spring of 2022. So really it's an important question. How do we bring the Russians to the negotiating table? How can we ensure they negotiate honestly so that they'll really be prepared to make some kind of compromise? At present, that doesn't seem very likely. So it's a question of if or when those two viewpoints come into contact. On the one hand, there are the plans of the new American administration to end this war quickly. And on the other hand, there's Russia, which is winning at the front and intends to keep going. So, in fact, there's some chance for Ukraine that these two opposing views will come into contact somehow, and then the American administration may want to change its approach and strengthen Ukraine in order to force Russia to negotiate, so that some kind of durable ceasefire can be brought about.
There are still many unknown factors in the discussion on a possible peace in Ukraine. Some of them will become clear after Donald Trump and his team take the reins in the US. But for now, let's sum up the state of Ukraine.
I think Ukraine has performed better than we could have expected. I mean, we here at OSW expected that Ukraine would put up a fight, it would resist. But the effectiveness of that resistance was a little surprising, in a positive sense, of course. I think we were also surprised by how ineffective the Russian army was, and those initial assumptions that it will be a rapid operation, that the Russian army won't encounter any significant resistance. Well, there were some crucial moments, such as the defense of Hostomel Airport, and other situations which really had a strong impact on how the war panned out. How the Ukrainians organized themselves, how they defended their fortitude, and it was on an individual basis. Very many individual soldiers, commanders, politicians, civic activists, but also the whole society. The awareness that not resisting is absolutely unacceptable, that they don't want to be occupied by Russia. This was something truly amazing, and in a way it was surprising. I think the country handled it very well, and to a certain extent this is down to the reforms introduced after 2014, after the revolution of dignity. For example, the banking system coped very well because of the reform to clean out the problem banks, get rid of the problem assets. The internet was online practically all of the time, the trains too, and they are very punctual. I could compare wartime Ukrainian trains with peacetime German trains, and the Ukrainian trains would come out on top. So I feel that the state and the citizens have passed the test. But the war's been going on for nearly 3 years, and these resources are running out, and patience is running out, and in a way, this resilience is running out. At some point, they will all run out, because they can't last indefinitely. So I have the impression that this is the moment which could be decisive for how the war continues to pan out. If there really are going to be peace talks, if only on a ceasefire, so that it's to Ukraine's advantage. The countries of the West have a big role to play here. If talks start, then they have to continue to support Ukraine, to keep showing Putin that the West is consolidated. It's determined to help Ukraine, because this will greatly strengthen the position of the West and Ukraine against Russia.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to OSW to keep up to date with how this story unfolds.